The courtroom was silent, except for the echo of my father's voice, reading the will that erased me. Each word hit like a gavel, measured, heavy, final. My name, once spoken with pride at every family dinner, was now replaced by a pause, a deliberate space where love used to live. He couldn't look at me. My mother couldn't either. Their faces stayed fixed, like portraits painted to forget emotion. When the judge slid the folder across the table toward me, the sound of paper scraping against wood felt louder than thunder. That was the sound of years, every sacrifice, every "I'm proud of you," every night I stayed when they needed me, turning into evidence. They thought ink could bury truth, that inheritance could measure worth. But they forgot. Every lie they signed had already been recorded, every secret, notarized by truth itself. That day, I didn't fight for money. I fought for acknowledgement. Because sometimes, justice isn't about winning, it's about being heard. I grew up believing that loyalty was louder than love. My parents built their lives around appearances, perfect smiles for the neighbors, charity galas for prestige, Christmas cards that made our family look like a portrait of happiness. Behind those pictures was silence, a silence that looked polite, but felt rehearsed. As the eldest, I became their responsible one. When Evan forgot deadlines or Emma quit another job, I was the one fixing it. Late night calls, balancing bills, smoothing over the chaos they left behind. It wasn't love that drove me. It was duty disguised as affection. And I carried it like a medal, not realizing it was a chain. When my father fell ill, I didn't hesitate. I handled everything. Hospital paperwork, insurance calls, the endless waiting rooms where time smelled like disinfectant and fear. My mother would look at me and whisper, "You're my anchor." I believed her. But anchors, I learned later, aren't meant to be seen. They're meant to stay underwater, keeping everyone else afloat while they rust in the dark. The first crack appeared quietly. Evan started visiting more often, not with laughter or help, but with questions, sharp ones. "Has Dad mentioned the will? Mom says you're overwhelmed. Maybe I should step in." My mother smiled when he said it. That soft, diplomatic smile she reserved for lies that sounded reasonable. She called it help. I called it preparation. After that, conversations shifted. They started closing doors when I walked into rooms. Dad would pat my hand and say, "You've got your own life now, honey. Don't worry about these things." His voice was gentle, but there was distance in it, like he was rehearsing detachment. I told myself it was practicality, that maybe, after years of carrying the weight, they were trying to protect me from it. But deep down, I knew. You can feel when your name starts to fade from the room. The last normal memory I have is from a Sunday lunch. The table was set perfectly, crystal glasses, roasted chicken, the scent of rosemary floating between us. Mom reached across the table, placed her hand on mine, and said, "Family always does what's fair." I remember nodding, believing her. Because love makes you want to believe, even when fairness is already being rewritten behind your back. That was the last lie I ever swallowed without question. The last time I mistook silence for peace. The day of the will reading wasn't supposed to be dramatic. It was supposed to be closure, a way to honor my father, to settle things with dignity. The conference room smelled faintly of mahogany polish and old paper. A brass clock ticked too loudly, counting down to something I didn't know was coming. The lawyer, Mr. Grayson, adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began reading. His tone was formal, sterile, until it wasn't. Halfway through, his eyes faltered. A pause. A glance toward my mother. Then toward me. My stomach tightened. He swallowed and continued, voice suddenly softer. "All primary estate assets will be transferred to Evan and Lily Reed. The eldest child, Beverly Reed, is excluded by personal decision. Excluded. The word didn't echo, it detonated. Quietly, cleanly, like a scalpel to the chest. For a moment, I thought I misheard him. Maybe there was an amendment, a missing clause, some kind of mistake. But no one moved to correct him. My father sat straight, hands clasped, eyes forward. My mother's gaze stayed on her lap, her fingers tracing invisible lines across her skirt. No one said my name. It wasn't about the money. It was about what it meant. Years of midnight drives to the ER. Of balancing his medication chart while Evan was too busy taking weekend trips. Of holding my mother's hand through every breakdown while she whispered, "You're the only one I can rely on." Now, all of that had been rewritten into nothing. I waited for my father to say something, to clear his throat, to glance my way, to offer a reason, even a bad one. But he didn't blink. I felt my breath falter. The air in the room thickened. When the lawyer asked if anyone wanted to make a statement, I almost did. But then I saw my mother's hand, resting gently on Evan's arm. That small, tender motion told me everything. It wasn't a mistake. It was choreography. So I stood up. No shouting. No scene. Just the sound of my heels against the marble floor. Each step echoed, crisp and final. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers in perfectly timed silences. Outside, the sunlight felt wrong. Too bright, too ordinary for what had just happened. I watched the cars pass by, families laughing inside them, completely unaware that my entire history had just been edited out of existence. And then I remembered something my father once said when I was younger, sitting beside him while he signed company papers. Paperwork is power, Beverly. People think power comes from presence, but it's really about what's written, what's filed, what's signed. He had smiled when he said it. Back then, I thought he was teaching me something noble. Now, it felt like he'd been foreshadowing his own crime. I looked back at the building one last time. My family still inside, dividing what used to be ours. That's when I realized this wasn't a loss. It was an opening statement. Because if paperwork was power, then I'd learn to write my own. If ink could bury truth, I'd find the pen that could resurrect it. That day, I didn't drive home right away. I sat in my car, replaying every moment, every line, every omission. Somewhere between disbelief and rage, I started to plan. Not revenge. Not yet. Just clarity. Because before you fight for justice, you have to understand the crime. And the crime here wasn't just greed. It was erasure, signed, sealed, and delivered under the guise of love. As I pulled away from the curb, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes looked unfamiliar, steady, unreadable. That's when I whispered, half to myself, half to the ghosts of the family I thought I had. Paperwork is power, Dad. Let's see who taught that lesson better. I didn't cry. Not that night. Not the ones that followed. Silence became my companion, thick, suffocating, loyal in a way people never were. Days turned into weeks. No calls, no apologies, not even a text. Just absence. Evan and Lily moved fast. Renovations began almost immediately. Fresh paint. New floors. The same house that once smelled like cinnamon and Sunday mornings now reeked of construction dust and betrayal. Mom posted pictures online, captions like, "Fresh beginnings, healing through change." Her smile looked polished, rehearsed. Like grief was just another performance. And there they were, Evan and Lily, standing in the living room I grew up in, holding champagne glasses, celebrating a victory I hadn't even realized was a war. But they forgot something. They forgot who handled the paperwork when Dad got sick. I was the one who kept the files alphabetized, who spoke to the accountants, who signed under authorized contact. I knew every transaction, every transfer, every unpaid tax that Evan conveniently forgot to declare. And I had the receipts. One evening, I sat at my old desk, the lamplight flickering over a stack of files. The edges of the pages were soft, frayed, like me. I began to reread everything. Slowly, patiently. The more I dug, the more the truth bled through the ink. Dates didn't match. Signatures changed shape. Dad's R suddenly looked more like Evan's. And the final version of the will? It was printed after Dad's last hospital admission. A time when he couldn't even hold a pen. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a crime wearing the mask of family. I remember the hum of the old clock beside me, the kind that ticks like a heartbeat. Each second sounded like a verdict. Tick, trust broken. Tick, truth uncovered. Tick, justice waiting. I started documenting everything. Photos, emails, handwriting samples, witness statements. Every lie they told was suddenly time-stamped, notarized by arrogance. I didn't post. I didn't scream. I didn't beg for anyone to believe me. I just built. Quietly. Meticulously. My rage found order in the way evidence stacked up, like poetry written in ink and law. Weeks later, I walked into my lawyer's office with a folder that felt heavier than guilt itself. He flipped through the pages in silence, his brows tightening with each turn. When he finally looked up, his voice was low, steady, almost reverent. "Beverly, this isn't revenge. This is a reckoning." I nodded, because he was right. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about integrity, about rewriting the story they tried to erase me from. At night, I'd drive past the house. Their lights glowed soft and warm through the curtains, laughter echoing faintly from the porch. But all I could think about was how fragile it all was. Because beneath those walls was a paper trail sharp enough to cut through every lie they'd built their peace upon. One signature at a time, I was reclaiming my place, not through confrontation, but through precision. Truth doesn't need to shout. It waits. Patiently. And I was done being the anchor that held everyone steady. It was time to become the tide that shifted everything. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive in thunder. Sometimes it walks in quietly, holding evidence instead of anger. And as I closed the final file that night, I whispered to the silence around me, "Let them keep painting over the cracks. I'm the one holding the blueprint." It was 2:47 a.m. when I realized sleep wasn't coming. The city outside my window hummed with a kind of loneliness that made silence feel alive. I sat cross-legged in the middle of my apartment floor, surrounded by files, photocopies, and yellow-edged notes. Every piece of paper told a story, signatures that trembled, transactions that lied, and margins filled with the kind of truth people tried to hide between the lines. The lamp beside me flickered, throwing slow, tired shadows across the room. And that's when I saw it, a document I hadn't touched in weeks. My father's final hospital record. The last page was folded, almost like it had been trying to stay hidden. I unfolded it carefully, the paper thin and fragile, like skin that had seen too much sun. And there it was, in neat blue ink, written by a nurse whose name I didn't recognize. Patient expressed confusion about signatures and family discussions regarding estate. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just evidence, it was confession. It was my father's voice, trembling through someone else's handwriting. He knew. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know how to stop it. That note wasn't just an observation, it was his unspoken plea for help. A message I was meant to find, even if it came too late for him to say it out loud. The anger I'd been carrying, sharp, jagged, hungry, began to melt. In its place came something colder, steadier. Purpose. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about proving them wrong or reclaiming what they took. It was about honoring the man who once taught me that truth doesn't vanish, it just waits for someone brave enough to uncover it. I remember whispering into the quiet, "You didn't sign your silence, Dad. You left me the truth." That night, I opened a blank folder on my desk and labeled it Case Beverly Reed versus Reed Estate. The sound of the keyboard clicking echoed like a heartbeat, slow, deliberate, certain. Every fact, every discrepancy, every dated signature, I lined them up like soldiers preparing for a quiet war. Not out of spite, out of principle. For years, I'd begged to be heard, to be seen, to be recognized as something more than the daughter who cleaned up everyone's mess. But that night, I realized I didn't need their permission to speak. The law would do it for me. The same courtroom that once silenced my voice would now echo it, letter by letter. Every affidavit would carry my father's confusion. Every exhibit would speak for the nights I spent in hospital corridors, holding his hand while they planned my erasure behind closed doors. It was poetic, really, how the very system they used to erase me would now be my weapon of truth. How ink, once used to betray me, would now become my redemption. I stayed up until dawn that night, sorting, scanning, organizing. The first light crept through the blinds, pale and soft, touching the edges of the papers scattered around me. The city woke slowly, unaware that in one small apartment, a war had already begun, not with noise, but with clarity. As I sealed the envelope with the first batch of evidence, a strange calm settled over me. For the first time in months, my hands didn't shake. This was no longer about being the daughter they dismissed. This was about being the voice they tried to bury. And as I stared at the sunlight breaking through, I knew they had built their empire on deception. I was about to introduce them to truth's quiet architecture. "They used ink to erase me," I whispered. "Now I'll use it to remember us, properly this time." Because justice doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it enters softly, through a nurse's note, through a daughter's persistence, through the sound of a single page turning under the weight of dawn. The courtroom smelled like dust and distance, old wood, cold air, and the kind of silence that could hear your heartbeat. My parents sat on the left, their faces composed but hollow. Evan leaned back in his chair, smirking, that same smirk he wore the day he told me, "Dad just wanted what's fair." Fair. A word that once meant love now tasted like betrayal. The judge entered, her robe a deep navy, her eyes unreadable. "All rise." Everyone stood, except my mother, who hesitated for a moment, the same hesitation she'd shown when choosing between truth and convenience. When my lawyer stood, his voice carried no anger, only clarity. "Your Honor," he began, "this is not a contest over inheritance. It is a petition for truth." That line echoed in me like a pulse, because that's all I ever wanted. Not revenge, not a share, just the truth, spoken out loud, where it couldn't be rewritten or ignored. We started with the timeline. Dates, signatures, transfers. Every slide that appeared on the courtroom screen was a thread, and I watched as those threads unraveled the story they had so carefully stitched. My father's medical record. His cognitive decline was documented in neat, emotionless handwriting. The nurse's note, the one I'd found under the dim light of my apartment, was presented next. When she took the stand, she looked nervous. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. "I remember Mr. Reed," she said softly. He seemed confused when his son brought papers for him to sign. He asked, "Why are there two wills?" My stomach tightened. My father's voice, through hers, filled the room. Evan's smirk faltered. My mother's eyes glistened. But I didn't look away. I couldn't. Because for once, the truth wasn't hidden in whispers, it was echoing off marble walls. Then came the handwriting expert, precise, methodical, merciless in detail. They compared my father's authentic signature from the power of attorney forms to the one on the revised will. The difference was undeniable. Even to the untrained eye, it looked forced. The stroke pressure differs. The pen angle changes mid-signature. This document was either coerced or replicated under duress, the expert stated. My lawyer turned to the judge, his tone unwavering. Your Honor, this is not an inheritance dispute. This is a family rewriting history through fraud. The words landed heavily. Even the air seemed to pause. Evan shifted in his seat, jaw clenched. Mom finally turned toward me. Her lips moved, barely, whispering my name like a confession she wished she could take back. For the first time in years, she looked small. Not cruel. Not cunning. Just human. And it hurt, because I remembered the version of her that once brushed my hair and told me, "Family always does what's fair." I wanted to believe she meant it. But maybe fairness was always just another word she used when love became inconvenient. The judge's voice broke through my thoughts. Court will recess for 10 minutes before final ruling. I stepped outside, into the hallway lined with muted portraits of past justices. The floor beneath me gleamed, polished, cold, unyielding. I caught my reflection in the glass. I didn't look angry or triumphant, just peaceful, like someone who had finally finished digging for air after years of drowning quietly. When we reconvened, the air felt heavier, like even the walls were waiting. The judge leaned forward, hands clasped. Her tone was measured, but her words cut through every layer of pretense my family had built. The court finds sufficient evidence of coercion and forgery. The revised will is hereby declared void. The original will, recognizing all children equally, is reinstated. The gavel struck once, sharp, final, undeniable. For a moment, no one moved. The silence wasn't awkward, it was sacred. Evan stared straight ahead, his jaw locked. My mother's eyes met mine again, full of something I hadn't seen in years. Regret. Not for losing the case. For losing me. But I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. Because justice doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it just feels quiet, like the sound of something heavy finally setting down. As the papers were collected and the courtroom began to empty, I stayed seated. The lawyer placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You did it," he said. I nodded, my eyes fixed on the bench where truth had finally been heard. "I didn't win," I whispered. "I just reclaimed what shouldn't have been taken." And that was enough. Because in that stillness, in that unspoken aftermath, they had to listen. They had to sit there as every truth they'd buried was read aloud, line by line, under oath. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was precise. Justice, I learned, doesn't shout. It documents. It notarizes. It waits, until even the liars have to stand still and hear it. As I walked out of the courtroom, the afternoon sun hit my face, warm, forgiving. The world outside felt lighter, almost as if it too had been holding its breath. I passed by my mother without a word. Her hand twitched, as if she wanted to reach out. But she didn't. Maybe she finally understood. Silence cuts both ways. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering the last autumn leaves across the courthouse steps. I paused, watching them spin before settling. That's what this was. Not revenge, not rage. Just settling. Because truth doesn't vanish when ignored. It lingers, patient, steady, until the right moment to be heard. And that day, in that courtroom filled with dust and distance, truth finally spoke my name back into existence. Months later, I didn't move back into the old house. I sold my share quietly, signed the papers without ceremony, and handed the keys to a family who looked nothing like mine, but smiled the way I once wished we had. I bought a small place by the coast. White walls, creaking floors, the sound of the sea spilling through the windows every morning. No marble floors. No chandeliers. Just space, honest and unpolished. Some nights, I still replay that day in the courtroom. The soft shuffle of papers. The faint echo when the judge said, "Forgery." And the way my mother's eyes flickered, not in guilt, but in recognition. It wasn't the word that broke her. It was the realization that I had become someone she couldn't control. Someone who could stand, steady and unshaken, in front of the truth she spent years decorating with lies. Sometimes I wonder if she ever understood what I truly wanted. It wasn't the estate. It wasn't the apology. It was acknowledgement, the simplest form of justice. To be seen without distortion. To exist without permission. Justice didn't give me back my family. It gave me back my name. I see it now, embossed on every legal file, recorded in court transcripts, printed in the official ruling. The same name they erased was now preserved under law, untouchable. And somehow, that permanence felt gentler than love. I keep one thing from that day, the nurse's note. It sits framed on my bookshelf, beside a small plant that leans toward the light. The ink has faded, but the words haven't. Patient expressed confusion about signatures and family discussions regarding estate. That single line started it all. It reminded me that truth hides in the quiet places, in margins, in footnotes, in the things people overlook because they're too busy curating appearances. Now, when the waves hit the shore outside my window, they sound like the gavel striking wood, distant, final and freeing. I don't check my family's updates anymore. They're new photos, new homes, new versions of the story. None of it matters. Because I've learned that silence isn't peace. It's preparation. And sometimes, silence becomes the loudest form of justice, when the people who once erased your voice are forced to live with the echo of it. They cut me out, thinking silence was surrender. But silence was a strategy. Because I wasn't waiting for their apology, I was preparing for my return. And in the end, the truth didn't need my voice. It spoke louder than my pain ever could. If this story hit somewhere deep, smash that like button. It tells YouTube this story mattered. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had to fight to be heard, when silence felt safer? And if you believe truth always finds its voice, subscribe now, because the next story might just echo yours. Remember, silence isn't surrender. It's the pause before justice speaks.